been a lot building up to this moment, and here I am, and here we are. And in line with what I'm wanting to talk about today, to talk about our relationship with ourself, our personal processes, and also how we feel, and being able to offer ourselves some acceptance and understanding around that. So what I wanted to do to start off, I'm very wary of being a stereotypical psychotherapist, but I thought maybe we could just have a moment to each check in with ourselves to see how we're feeling today. I guess we're going to have come straight here, would have sat down, listened to the talks, and what I'm wanting to do is just create a bit of space, maybe 30 seconds, for you to be able to say, how am I feeling today? And then once we're all more in touch with that, I will get started. Okay, that may have been more for me than you as well, but, helpful. So, I want to talk a little bit about the person in nursing. I think Leanne has done a great job of representing the profession, what you're up against, what you experience. But before our jobs, before the structures that we operate in, we are people with our own processes, our own feelings that we bring into our work. And so what I'm hoping to do today is to allow us to get more in touch with that, but not only to be more in touch with it, but the way that we relate to ourselves when we realize what we are experiencing too. So to give a brief outline of what I'm going to look at today, I'm going to do a little bit of an introduction about how we came to this topic. I'm going to talk a little bit about myself, why I'm here, why I'm talking about this subject, and then primarily move on to the person-centered approach, which is an approach to psychotherapy that I use and I hold very dear to my heart, and is basically the crux of what I'm going to be talking to you about today. And then from that, I'm going to extract something called psychological tension. In person-centered theory, psychological tension is basically the reason we feel the majority of any distress that we experience. So what I'm hoping to do is, if I can make that clearer to you, explain that to you, it might give you something to take away to be more aware of your experience, how you might relate to yourselves, and hopefully ease any distress you might be feeling. Okay. So a brief introduction. I think Leanne has done a really good job of capturing how we came to this talk. When I was first asked to do it, I was kind of asked, how can I give you some things that prevent anxiety, that prevent being up at 3 a.m., that prevent the stresses that you might experience at work? And in line with the way that I work as a psychotherapist and also the person-centered approach, what I believe is more important is how we can actually offer acceptance to ourselves and those experiences. The more that we try and deny or distort our anxiety or difficult feelings, the stronger they will become. So what I'm hoping to look at today is how we might be able to offer ourselves and others more understanding and acceptance. Okay, a little bit about me. So I've been working as just over 15 years as a therapist. I started pretty young. I spent thousands of pounds on a philosophy and theology degree and then realized that wasn't what I was meant to be doing. And then I found counseling, and that really hit the mark for me. As a child that was kind of sensitive, trying to find his way in the world, relate to people in a good way, when I first read Carl Rogers, who was the founder of the person-centered approach, I felt like it was a homecoming, like many people do. Here was someone not talking about what we need to do to other people, but how we can be with them. And primarily this was based on an idea of understanding, acceptance, and authenticity. And that is what I'm hopefully going to share with you today. Because this approach is very special to me, I try and spread it wherever I can. That's part of the reason that I'm here, and I want to share it with you today. And I think maybe even more so in today's world, there is more place for a need for empathy, for acceptance, and for authenticity. So I try and share this in writing. You'll be able to find some in the Wounds journals. And I've also opened a person-centered training centre in Brighton to try and qualify people as counsellors in this approach and spread it too. But to become more personal about this, I also talk to you in the middle of what I'm calling a semi-sabbatical. So when I go on to talk about psychological tension shortly and the impacts this can have, I have lived it and I'm living it myself. The psychological tension got to a point where it felt too much and that I had to almost retreat and make space for myself to return to my authentic self. So I don't bring this as a textbook theory that I just relate to theoretically. I think this is something that we can live and continue to live, and I'm hoping I'm doing justice to it as well. So, a little bit about the person-centered approach. This is a theory that we teach in about 3 years, and I'm going to try and put it into 3 minutes. So it will be a little bit brief, but I want to extract the main parts of this. You may be familiar with something like person-centered care, which certainly has crossover with the person-centered approach, but there are certain aspects of this approach which was founded by Carl Rogers, which are specific both to the counselling room, but also in our relationships with others and ourselves. I'm just going to have some water. The first thing, and maybe most important thing to say about this slide, there is no accident that he is looking at the text and my words of wisdom that have been put down there as well. So I just felt important to make that clear before I go into it. So the thing that was most important about the person-centered approach, when it first came out and was kind of shared as a new approach to counselling, is that it flew in the face of everything that came before it. If we look at someone like Freud, Freud is talking about the therapist being the expert. The client has neurosis, and we as therapists need to tell them what to do and how to heal themselves. Carl Rogers did the opposite of this. He came out and said, what if the client knows best? What if actually our job is, as a therapist, is to create space for the client to find their own answers? And for this reason, it is founded on a profound respect for individuals, their autonomy, and their direction. Another thing that's important about this is that the approach can be classed as amoral. If we don't relate to people through a right or wrong or a good or bad, we can give them the freedom to do and choose however they wish. And that is what Rogers hoped to provide in his counselling relationships. And primarily this was based on 3 conditions, which was understanding, acceptance, and authenticity. The main thing that I want to take out of this for the talk is this idea of psychological tension. So having set the ground for how we get here, I want to spend the rest of the time looking at psychological tension. And in short, that is saying nearly all the distress that we experience as individuals is a result of psychological tension. Okay. So, I may have put a little bit of a negative slant on this. I was trying to think about what is it as nurses that you may feel a lot? What is it that you will experience in your day-to-day life, in your work life? And these are some of the words that I came up with. What is important about this, in an ideal world, if we were in touch with experiencing all of these things and we allowed them to be present without trying to do anything to them, Rogers is saying in his theory, we would experience very little distress in our lives. So what he's talking about, the thing that causes us distress in our lives is when we begin to deny or distort that we are actually having these feelings. So it is not, how do I stop feeling anxious? How do I stop feeling stressed at work? It's more about being able to acknowledge and get in touch with the fact that we do feel anxious and that we do feel stressed. There's a great quote from Rogers which sums this up, because I think when we talk about self-help, when we talk about psychology, often we can have this image which is of an ideal state, that we will be calm, that we will be content, that we will be happy. But what Rogers says is that the good life is not about feeling good, but about being good at feeling. And I think this is the crux of what we're talking about here. If we get to a better place with ourselves, it's not that we will be zen and calm all the time, but that actually we might be able to allow ourselves to feel the very things that we feel. So, here comes the problem. This is what often happens, is that we have an experience of feeling something, and this is replaced with a view that we shouldn't be feeling this way. And this is what causes psychological tension in people. Now, the important thing about this is that it will not often come out straightforward. So it's not often that we will say to ourselves, I should not be feeling anxious. This is almost like an unconscious drive that happens in us, and that we have different ways of suppressing this. So for myself, when clients often come to see me for counselling, it's not that they will come by saying, I'm in psychological tension, obviously. They will say things like, I'm struggling to sleep. I'm not eating the same as I used to. My friendships and my relationships are suffering. And ultimately, what is at the root of all of this is the denial that we have on the feelings that we are having. And just to say briefly, just to give some insight if you want to take this away with you, is the reason that we do this is because of the conditionality that is put onto us. This is not just in the world, but primarily this is from our primary caregivers. So we are given lots and lots and lots of messages, often implicitly, from those who bring us up or are around us. So one thing that might be helpful to think about, just in trying to get in touch with what your conditions might be, is if your family had a motto about how you should be in the world, what would that be? This will often give you a good insight into why you might feel the way you do. If our family motto might be strong, work hard, what about the times when we don't feel strong? What about the times that we are vulnerable? The times that we don't have the energy or we don't want to go to work? What do we do with those feelings when we have this conditionality that is placed on top of it? So this is often, as I say, a very discrete process that happens. but it can be helpful to just check in with what might be my rules. What rules have I been given by my family, by society, by my caregivers? Because these are often the things that we deny the most. And the last thing I just want to say before we have a 2-minute pause is that the ideal that we might try and come to is that there is an overlap between these things. That not only do we start to notice how we truly feel, but that we can also be accepting and curious about that too. So that we can take time to just say, okay, I'm anxious. That is how I'm feeling. I can't deny it. We don't choose our feelings, so if I'm feeling anxious, it is there for a reason. And to be curious about why that might be there. It's interesting that even when I was doing this talk and this theory that I know and hold so dearly, I had my own process of this in doing the talk. I went through my own process of denying that, no, you're not anxious about doing a talk. You do this every week. This is fine. It was only when I could say to myself, yeah, I want this to go well, and I'm anxious about it, that it began to ease in me. So this can be sometimes a lifelong process. It can be a difficult process, and it can also be extremely discreet in terms of what is actually going on within us. But I think what is important, and what I'll move on to shortly, is to look at how we might relate to ourselves. Can we give ourselves curiosity? Can we give ourselves acceptance to what we're actually feeling rather than what we feel we should be feeling? And that's what I want to move on to. After we've had our brief pause, I'm going to finish up by saying what we might be able to do to help with this, that you can take away with you from this and begin that process of checking in and improving the relationship with yourself. Okay, so for this final bit, just to look at what we might be able to do as nurses, as people, to help with this issue, and hopefully make lives a little easier for ourselves in the process too. The first thing that I want to say about this is that it isn't an easy task. We live in an incongruent world, and when I say that, I mean a kind of inauthentic world. So the structures that we move in are full of shoulds and full of ways that we should be in the world. So I think it is a radical act to actually find our authenticity in the face of this. But I also want to say that this might make it a little harder. This can mean that it's a little like swimming upstream, because the structures that surround us often breed inauthenticity. Like Leanne was saying about resilience, resilience might have a good intention as a word, but that can equally become a should. It can equally promote inauthenticity in us, and to deny when we're not feeling resilient, when we don't want to face those things that we struggle with. So the first thing I want to say is that this starts with self-awareness. When we look at something like authenticity, we need to have a relatively good self-awareness to be able to know what we actually feel. So this is a process in itself. And often we need to maybe make intentional space to check in, a little like we did at the start of this talk, because so often we can just keep going on to the next thing, onto the next thing, onto the next thing. How often might we make space to actually check in with how we are doing, how we're feeling? So I think it's important that this often needs to be an intentional act, to first make space and then be able to check in with how we are feeling. And making space can also be removing things. If I think about something like social media, we are basically getting screenfuls of shoulds. I should be having a better time. I should be living this life. I should go on holiday. Wish I had friends like that. So making space is also about removing things that might increase shoulds in our lives. The other thing I want to say is that the acceptance and the inquiry that we have with ourselves can be our own little secret if you want. It doesn't need to be life-changing. You don't need to change everything in your life immediately. But the most important part in terms of psychological tension is that we can say to ourselves, I don't think I like this job anymore. We don't have to change anything, but knowing this and acknowledging it is the first step in being able to live a more authentic life. The other thing I wanted to share just briefly is we can be our own worst enemy. I'm sure we can relate to that. And so sometimes we might need to trick our bias. I know for myself, if I can give myself a hard time or I think, why did you say that? I can't believe you did that. Sometimes I might say to myself, if my friend was telling me that they did the same thing, how would I relate to them? And this immediately shows me the difference in how I relate to myself and how I relate to other people. So this can also help us in realizing how we really feel and maybe offering ourselves a little bit more acceptance and understanding. And the last thing I want to say just before I finish off is, whilst this might feel safer and easier on our own, there may also be times that we need someone else to help us with this process. So we may be able to do a fair bit of work ourselves, but I think it can also be important, friends that don't bring shoulds with them, friends that will listen to us, that will accept us and try to understand us as deeply as they can to help us make sense of our processes and our feelings. And of course, this is where things like counselling might come into play. I've put supervision on there because I feel grateful that as a counsellor, I have a requirement to have supervision. And I'm still amazed that supervision isn't a requirement in most jobs like your own. Because this means we have a space to check in with how we're actually feeling about the work that we do and share this in a safe and confidential place. Okay, so just to finish off, I just want to recap the main things that I've spoken about. That often the struggles we face in our lives are not necessarily about the feelings themselves, but how we relate to the feeling and how we relate to ourselves. So it is not anxiety that is the problem, but it's how we feel about being anxious and what we do in the face of being anxious. I believe, I am slightly biased, but I believe the person-centered approach gives us a good foundation to work out why we experience distress in our lives, and also, therefore, what we can do about it to try and ease that. And this idea that psychological tension is a result of incongruence. So the more inauthentic we are with ourselves, with our process, with our feelings, the more difficulty we're going to face. And just to re-emphasize that idea of not being authentic, often we won't know we're being inauthentic, but we will have lots of signs in our lives that things are not in the right place. And so therefore, the more authentic we can be, the more accepting we can be towards ourselves, the more understanding we can be to our own process, I think it gives us the best chance of living a more authentic and stress-free life. And just to finish up, I think a quote from Carl Rogers that captures all of this, what I'm trying to say, is that the curious paradox is that when I accept myself just as I am, then I can change. We spend so much of our lives trying to force change onto ourselves, make sure we feel a certain way or don't feel a certain way. But actually, the key to this is offering ourselves acceptance. Okay, I'm happy to talk more about this at any point. I will be around until Tuesday. If you do want to get in touch, my details are there. If you'd like to geek out with me on person-centered theory, I also have a YouTube channel which goes into depth into all of these areas that I've spoken about today, under Chris the Counsellor. So, the last thing I want to say is that I really appreciate your attention and your time and to allowing me to share this with you. So thank you very much.